What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Dr. Archie Rosenberg at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. A third city-state was officially created in 1982. That city-state is called the District of Columbia and is located on 10 square miles of land in the heart of Washington. The District of Columbia flies its own flag and has its own independent constitution. Although geographically separate, the city-states of London, the Vatican and the District of Columbia are one interlocking empire called Empire of the City. The flag of Washington's District of Columbia has 3 red stars, one for each city-state in the 3-city empire. This corporate empire of 3 city-states controls the world economically, through London's inner city militarily, through the District of Columbia, and spiritually through the Vatican. The constitution for the District of Columbia operates under a tyrannical Roman law known as Lex Fori, which bears no resemblance to the US Constitution. When Congress passed the Act of 1871, it created a separate corporate government for the District of Columbia. This treasonous act allowed the District of Columbia to operate as a corporation outside the original Constitution of the United States and outside of the best interests of American citizens. A sobering study of the signed treaties and charters between Britain and the United States exposes a shocking truth: the United States has always been and still is a British Crown colony. King James I was famous not for just changing the Bible into the King James Version, but for signing the first Charter of Virginia in 16006. The charter granted America's British forefathers a license to settle and colonize America. The charter also guaranteed that future kings and queens of England would have sovereign authority over all the citizens and colonized land in America stolen from the native to Turtle Island. After America declared its independence from Great Britain, the Treaty of 1783 was signed. The treaty specifically identifies the King of England as the Prince of the United States and contradicts the belief that America won the War of Independence. Although King George III of England gave up most of his claims over his American colonies, he kept his right to continue receiving payment for his business venture of colonizing America. If America had really won the War of Independence, they would never have agreed to pay debts and reparations to the King of England. When Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the US President was made subservient to the King of England. The 13th Amendment is called the Title of Nobility Amendment and forbids US presidents and their officials from using royal titles like king or prince or baron for some mysterious reason. The 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1810, no longer appears on current copies of the Constitution. America's blood-soaked War of Independence against the British bankrupted America and turned its citizens into permanent debt slaves of the king. In the War of 1812, the British torched and burned to the ground the White House and all US government buildings and destroyed ratification records of the US Constitution 1 century later. A corrupt US Congress committed the biggest theft in world history. They passed Paul Warburg Federal Reserve Act in 1913, handing over America's gold and silver reserves and total control of America's economy to the Rothschild banksters. Most Americans still believe that the Fed, our Federal Reserve, is the government. It is not. The Fed is a privately owned banking system whose majority Class A shareholders are the Rothschilds, Warburg, Kuhn and Loeb, JP, Morgan Rockefeller, Israel Seif and the Lehman Brothers. This private banking cartel is the Fed and is never audited and never pays taxes. They print and design America's money, which displays their symbols of an Egyptian pyramid, a Masonic all-seeing eye, and the words "In God we trust." Who exactly is the God they trust? They also collect American taxpayers' money through the IRS. Then they loan it back again with interest to pay for roads, bridges, and other public works. American presidents are handpicked and financed by these special interest power groups like George W. Bush. John Forbes Carey, whose initials are JFK, is a member of Yale University's Skull and Bones Brotherhood. The Forbes part of John Kay's name identifies his descendancy from Captain Robert Bennett Forbes, who is a drug runner for the Rothschilds' opium drug trade with China in the 1800s. Most US citizens believe that the United States is a country and that the president is the most powerful man on earth. The United States is not a country, it is a corporation, and the president is president of the corporation of the United States. He and his elected officials work for the corporation, not for the American people, since the United States is a corporation who owns the corporation of the United States. Like Canada and Australia, whose leaders are prime ministers of the Queen and whose land is called Crown Land, the United States is just another crown colony. Crown colonies are controlled by the empire of 3 city-states. At the center of each city-state is a towering phale-IC-shaped stone monument called an obelisk that points skyward. In DC city-state, the obelisk, known as the Washington Monument, was dedicated to Freemason George Washington by the Freemason Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. How did London, a city of fog and history, become the financial epicenter of the world? Let's dive in. Beneath the iconic skyline of London lies a secret: the Lords of Finance. With 805 sitting members, they control vast sums of capital. Since the Bank of England's inception in 1694, London has wielded immense power. Even the US Federal Reserve's roots trace back to London's influence. So next time you think of global finance, remember it all circles back to London, the true lords of finance. And so you see, my dear Coningsby, that the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. Disraeli, Prime Minister of England during Queen Victoria's reign, in 1775, the colonists of America declared their independence from Great Britain and subsequently won their freedom by the American Revolution. Now, keep in mind the British Empire is the Moorish Empire. Although they achieved political freedom, financial independence proved to be a more difficult matter. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, at the behest of European bankers, formed the first Bank of the United States, a central bank with much the same powers as the Bank of England. The foreign influences behind this bank, more than a century later, were able to get the Federal Reserve Act through Congress, giving them, at last, the central bank of issue for our economy. Although the Federal Reserve Bank was neither federal, being owned by private stockholders, nor a reserve, because it was intended to create money instead of to hold it in reserve, it did achieve enormous financial power, so much so that it has gradually superseded the popular elected government of the United States. Through the Federal Reserve System, American independence was stealthily but invincibly absorbed back into the British sphere of influence. Thus, the London connection became the arbiter of policy of the United States. Because of England's loss of her colonial empire after the Second World War, it seemed that her influence as a world political power was waning. Essentially, this was true. The England of 1980 is not the England of 1880. She no longer rules the waves. She's a second-rate, perhaps third-rate, military power. But paradoxically, as her political and military power waned, her financial power grew. In Capital City, we find, on almost any measure you care to take, London is the world's leading financial centre. In the 1960s, London dominance increased. A partial explanation of this fact is given. Daniel Davison, head of London's Morgan Grenfell, said the American banks have brought the necessary money, customers and capital and skills which have established London in its present preeminence. Only the American banks have a lender of last resort. The Federal Reserve Board of the United States can and does create dollars when necessary. Without the Americans, the big dollar deals cannot be put together. Without them, London would not be credible as an international financial center. Thus, London is the world's financial center because it can command enormous sums of capital, created at its command by the Federal Reserve Board of the United States. But how is this possible? We have already established that the monetary policies of the United States, the interest rates, the volume and value of money and sales of bonds are decided, not by the figurehead of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, but by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The pretended decentralization of the Federal Reserve System and its 12 equally autonomous regional banks is and has been a deception since the Federal Reserve Act became law in 1913. That United States monetary policy stems solely from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is yet another fallacy. That the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is itself autonomous and free to set monetary policy for the entire United States without any outside interference is especially untrue. We might believe in this autonomy if we did not know that the majority stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was purchased by three New York City banks: First National Bank, National City Bank, and the National Bank of Commerce. An examination of the principal stockholders in these banks in 1914 and today reveals a direct London connection. In 1812, the National City Bank began business as the Citibank in the same room in which the defunct Bank of the United States, whose charter had expired, had been doing business. It represented many of the same stockholders who were now functioning under a legitimate American charter. During the early 1800s, the most famous name associated with Citibank was Moses Taylor, 1806 to 1882. Taylor's father had been a confidential agent employed in buying property for the Astor interests while concealing the fact that Astor was the purchaser. Through this tactic, Astor succeeded in buying many farms and also a great deal of potentially valuable real estate in Manhattan. Although Astor's capital was reputed to come from his fur trading, a number of sources indicate that he also represented foreign interests. LaRouche 58 states that Astor, in exchange for providing intelligence to the British during the years before and after the Revolutionary War, and for inciting Indians to attack and kill American settlers along the frontier, received a handsome reward. He was not paid cash, but was given a percentage of the British opium trade with China. It was the income from this lucrative concession which provided the basis for the Astor fortune. With his father's connection with the Astors, young Moses Taylor had no difficulty in finding a place as apprentice in a banking house at the age of 15. Like so many others in these pages, he found his greatest opportunities when many other Americans were going bankrupt during an abrupt contraction of credit. During the Panic of 1837, when more than half the business firms in New York failed, he doubled his fortune. In 1855, he became president of Citibank. During the Panic of 1857, the Citibank profited by the failure of many of its competitors. Like George Peabody and Junius Morgan, Taylor seemed to have an ample supply of cash for buying up distressed stocks. He purchased nearly all the stock of Delaware-Lackawanna Railroad for $5 a share. 7 years later, it was selling for $240 a share. Moses Taylor was now worth $50 million. In August 1861, Taylor was named chairman of the Loan Committee to finance the Union government in the Civil War. The committee shocked Lincoln by offering the government $5 million at 12% to finance the war. Lincoln refused and financed the war by issuing the famous greenbacks through the U.S. Treasury, which were backed by gold. Taylor continued to increase his fortune throughout the war, and in his later years, the youthful James Stillman became his protege. In 1882, when Moses Taylor died, he left $70 million. His son-in-law, Percy Pyne, succeeded him as president of Citibank, which had now become National City Bank. Pyne was paralyzed and was barely able to function at the bank. For 9 years, the bank stagnated, nearly all its capital being the estate of Moses Taylor. William Rockefeller, brother of John D. Rockefeller, had bought into the bank and was anxious to see it progress. He persuaded Pyne to step aside in 1891 in favor of James Stillman, and soon the National City Bank became the principal repository of the Rockefeller oil income. William Rockefeller's son, William, married Elsie, James Stillman's daughter, Isabel. Like so many others in New York banking, James Stillman also had a British connection. His father, Don Carlos Stillman, had come to Brownsville, Texas, as a British agent and blockade runner during the Civil War. Through his banking connections in New York, Don Carlos had been able to find a place for the New York Times noted on May 24, 1882, that Moses Taylor was chairman of the Loan Committee of the Associated Banks of New York City in 1861. $200 million worth of securities were entrusted to him. It is probably due to him more than any other one man that the government in 1861 found itself with the means to prosecute the war, his son as apprentice in a banking house. In 1914, when National City Bank purchased almost 10% of the shares of the newly organized Federal Reserve Bank of New York, two of Moses Taylor's grandsons, Moses Taylor Pyne and Percy Pyne, owned 15,000 shares of National City stock. Moses Taylor's son, Hack Taylor, owned 7,699 shares of National City Bank. The bank's attorney, John W. Sterling, of the firm of Shearman and Sterling, also owned 6,000 shares of National City Bank. However, James Stillman owned 47,498 shares, or almost 20% of the bank's total shares of 250,000. The second largest purchaser of Federal Reserve Bank of New York shares in 1914, First National Bank, was generally known as the Morgan Bank because of the Morgan representation on the board, although the bank's founder George F. Baker held 20,000 shares and his son G. F. Baker Jr. had 5,000 shares for 25% of the bank's total stock of 100,000 shares. George F. Baker Sr.'s daughter married George F. St. George of London. The St. George later settled in the United States, where their daughter Catherine St. George became a prominent congresswoman for a number of years. Dr. E. M. Josephson wrote of her, Mrs. St. George, a first cousin of FDR and New Dealer, said, "Democracy is a failure." George Baker Jr.'s daughter, Edith Brevoort Baker, married Jacob Schiff's grandson, John M. Schiff, in 1934. John M. Schiff is now honorary chairman of Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb Company. The third large purchase of Federal Reserve Bank of New York stock in 1914 was the National Bank of Commerce, which issued 250,000 shares. J.P. Morgan, through his controlling interest in Equitable Life, which held 24,700 shares, and Mutual Life, which held 17,294 shares of National Bank of Commerce, also held another 10,000 shares of National Bank of Commerce through J.P. Morgan and Company, 7,800 shares, J.P. Morgan Jr., 1,100 shares, and Morgan partner H.P. Davison, 1,100 shares. Paul Warburg, a governor of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, also held 3,000 shares of National Bank of Commerce. His partner, Jacob Schiff, had 1,000 shares of National Bank of Commerce. This bank was clearly controlled by Morgan, who was really a subsidiary of Junius S. Morgan Company in London and the N.M. Rothschild Company of London, and Kuhn Loeb Company, which was also known as a principal agent of the Rothschilds. The financier, Thomas Fortune Ryan, also held 5,100 shares of National Bank of Commerce stock in 1914. His son John Barry Ryan married Otto Kahn's daughter. Kahn was a partner of Warburg and Schiff in Kuhn Loeb Company. Ryan's granddaughter, Virginia Fortune Ryan, married Lord Airlie, the present head of J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation in London and New York. Another director of National Bank of Commerce in 1914, A.D. Joulard, was president of A.D. Joulard Company, a trustee of New York Life and Guaranty Trust, all of which were controlled by J.P. Morgan. Joulard also had a British connection, being a director of the North British and Mercantile Insurance Company. Joulard owned 2,000 shares of National Bank of Commerce stock and was also a director of Chemical Bank. In The Robber Barons by Matthew Josephson, Josephson tells us that Morgan dominated New York Life, Equitable Life and Mutual Life by 1900, which had $1 billion in assets and which had $50 million a year to invest. He says, in this campaign of secret alliances, he, Morgan, acquired direct control of the National Bank of Commerce, then a part ownership in the First National Bank, allying himself to the very strong and conservative financier George F. Baker, who headed it. Then, by means of stock ownership and interlocking directorates, he linked to the first-named bank's other leading banks, the Hanover, the Liberty, and Chase. Mary W. Harriman, widow of E. H. Harriman, also owned 5,000 shares of National Bank of Commerce in 1914. E. H. Harriman's railroad empire had been entirely financed by Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company. Levi P. Morton also owned 1,500 shares of National Bank of Commerce stock in 1914. He had been the 22nd Vice President of the United States, was an ex-minister from the U.S. to France, and President of L.P. Morton Company, New York, Morton Rose and Company, and Morton Chaplin of London. He was a director of Equitable Life Insurance Company, Home Insurance Company, Guaranty Trust, and Newport Trust. The astounding idea that the Federal Reserve System of the United States is actually operated from London will probably be rejected at first hearing by most Americans. However, Minsky has become famous for his theory of the dominant frame. He states that in any particular situation there is a dominant frame to which everything in that situation is related and through which it can be interpreted. The dominant frame in the monetary policy decisions of the Federal Reserve System is that these decisions are made by those who stand to benefit most from them. At first glance, this would seem to be the principal stockholders of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. However, we have seen that these stockholders all have a London connection. The London connection becomes more obvious as the dominant power when we find in the capital city 61 that only 17 firms are allowed to operate as merchant bankers in the City of London, England's financial district. All of them must be approved by the Bank of England. In fact, most of the governors of the Bank of England come from the partners of these 17 firms. Clark ranks the 17 in order of their capitalization. Number 2 is the Schroeder Bank. Number 6 is Morgan Grenfell, the London branch of the House of Morgan, and actually its dominant branch. Lazard Brothers is number 8, N.M. Rothschild is number 9. Brown Shipley Company, the London branch of Brown Brothers Harriman, is number 14. These 5 merchant banking firms of London actually control the New York banks, which own the controlling interest in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The control over Federal Reserve System decisions is also founded in another unique situation. Each day, representatives of 4 other London banking firms meet in the offices of N.M. Rothschild Company in London to fix the price of gold for that day. The other 4 bankers are from Samuel Montague Company, which ranks number 5 on the list of 17 London merchant banking firms, Sharps, Pixley, Johnson Matheson and Mokata and Goldsmith. Despite the huge tide of paper pyramided currency and notes which are now flooding the world, at some point every credit extension must return to be based in however minuscule a fashion on some deposit of gold in some bank somewhere in the world. Because of this factor, the London merchant bankers, with their power to set the price of gold each day, become the final arbiters of the volume of money and the price of money in those countries which must bow to their power. Not the least of these is the United States. No official of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors can command the power over the money of the world, which is held by these London merchant bankers. Great Britain, while waning in political and military power, today exercises the greatest financial power. It is for this reason that London is the present financial centre of the world.